Imagine for a second that the world as you know it simply ends. Not with a bang, not with a sudden flash of light, but with a low, rhythmic thumping on the horizon that grows into a deafening roar. In the year 1221, the people of Merv, one of the most beautiful and sophisticated cities in the world, looked out from their walls and saw exactly that. They saw a dust cloud so vast it blotted out the sun, and out of that dust emerged a force that didn't just want their gold or their land, it seemed to want the very memory of their existence. Within days, a city of over 500,000 people was gone. Not just conquered. Gone. The contemporary accounts say the Mongols ordered every single citizen to be executed, and to make sure no one was faking it, they demanded that each soldier bring back a severed ear. This wasn't just war. This was something the world hadn't seen before and wasn't prepared for. It was a machine. A terrifying, horse-mounted, recurve bow-wielding machine that was about to redraw the map of the planet. But to understand how a group of nomadic tribes from the freezing, wind-swept plains of Central Asia managed to bring the greatest empires on Earth to their knees, we have to look past the blood and the fire. We have to look at one man, a man born into a world of betrayal, where your best friend would kill you for a horse and your own tribe would leave you to starve in the snow. This is the story of how Temujin became Genghis Khan, and how he turned the steppe into a storm that didn't stop until it hit the shores of the Adriatic and the jungles of Vietnam. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Ate a Fish. History usually remembers the great Khans as these larger-than-life figures, almost like gods of war. But Temujin's story starts in the most pathetic way possible. He wasn't born in a palace. He was born in a tent, clutching a blood clot in his fist which the shaman said was a sign he'd be a great warrior. It was a nice thought, but reality had other plans. When Temujin was just 9, his father, Yesuge, was poisoned by a rival tribe, the Tatars. Now, in the brutal meritocracy of the steppe, if your leader dies and his heir is a child, you don't stick around to help. You leave. Temujin's own clan, the Tainshid, abandoned him, his mother Holen, and his siblings. They took the livestock and left a woman and 5 children to starve on the tundra. This is the forge where the Mongol Empire was actually built. Temujin spent his childhood eating roots, berries, and the occasional field mouse. It was a dog-eat-dog existence, literally. At one point, Temujin got so fed up with his older half-brother, Bektar, stealing a fish he'd caught that he and his brother Kasar cornered Bektar and executed him with arrows. At 12 years old, that's the kind of environment we're talking about. There was no room for mercy, only survival. He was eventually captured by the very clan that abandoned him, forced to wear a wooden collar called a kang, treated like a dog. But Temujin was smart. He escaped, he made alliances, and most importantly, he found his blood brother, Jamuka. Now, keep that name in mind, because the relationship between Temujin and Jamuka is the ultimate frenemy story of the Middle Ages. They swore eternal loyalty, sleeping under the same blanket, promising to unite the Mongols. But there was a fundamental difference between them. Jamuka was an aristocrat. He believed that only those of noble white-bone descent should lead. Temujin, he didn't care about your dad. He cared if you could shoot a bow and if you were loyal. He built a meritocracy in a world of feudal lords. And that difference would eventually lead to a civil war that would soak the steppe in blood. Chapter 2. The birth of Genghis Khan. By the time we get to 1206, the steppe is a different place. Temujin has spent years fighting, bribing, and outthinking every rival Khan. He's defeated the Tatars, the guys who killed his dad, the Naimans, and finally, his old friend Jamuka. The story goes that when Temujin finally captured Jamuka, he offered him a place by his side. But Jamuka knew the world wasn't big enough for 2 sons. He asked for an honorable death one without spilling blood on the ground, as was Mongol tradition for nobles, so Temujin had his back broken. With no rivals left, a great assembly called a Kurultai was held at the source of the Anan River. There, the nomadic tribes of the north did something they'd never done before. They united under a single banner. They gave Temujin a new title, Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, but Genghis had a problem. He'd just spent 20 years turning the Mongols into the greatest army on the planet, but the Mongols were a culture built on raiding. If they weren't fighting outsiders, they'd start fighting each other again. He needed a target. He needed them to keep us together. To the south sat the Xizia and the Jin dynasty of China. To the Mongols, these people were soft. They lived in cities. They wore silk, and they had more wealth than the Mongols could even imagine. But they also had walls, huge, terrifying stone walls. At this point, the Mongols were a light cavalry force. They didn't have catapults. They didn't have ladders. They were guys on horses with bows. When Genghis first attacked the Xizia in 1205, it was a learning curve. They tried to flood a city by diverting a river, but they messed up the engineering and ended up flooding their own camp instead. It was a super simplified mistake, but Genghis Khan was a genius of adaptation. He didn't just walk away, he recruited Chinese engineers. He realized that if you can't break a wall, you make the people inside want to come out. Or you make the guys who built the wall work for you. Chapter 3, The Dragon and the Horse. In 1211, Genghis turned his sights toward the Jin dynasty. Now, the Jin were no joke. They had an army of nearly 1 million men. They had the Great Wall or versions of it. They had thunder crash bombs and massive crossbows. On paper, the Mongols should have been crushed, but the Jin were arrogant. They looked at the Mongols as forest people and stinking nomads. When the Mongol messengers arrived at the Jin court, the Jin emperor basically told Genghis to get lost. Genghis's response was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He didn't just attack the wall, he went around it. He used the crowded forest tactic, where the Mongol army would spread out over hundreds of miles and then converge like a pincer. He used prisoners as human shields, forcing Chinese peasants to march in front of his army, so the Jin soldiers would have to kill their own people to get to the Mongols. The siege of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, in 1215 was the turning point. The city was massive, with walls so thick you could drive multiple chariots across the top. The Mongols couldn't just charge in, so they waited. They starved the city. They waited until the inhabitants were eating their own clothes and then each other. When the city finally fell, the slaughter was so intense that months later, travelers said the streets were greasy with human fat and the soil was black with blood. The Jin emperor fled south, and Genghis Khan realized something. The world was much, much bigger than the steppe, and he wanted all of it. But even as North China burned, Genghis wasn't looking for a world empire yet. He wanted trade. He sent a massive caravan of 500 men to the Khwarezmian Empire, modern-day Iran, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan to establish a trade deal. He basically sent a "hey, let's be friends and get rich" message to the Shah. The Shah's governor at the border city of Otrar made the single biggest mistake in human history. He accused the caravan of being spies, which, to be fair, they probably were, and had them executed. When Genghis sent 3 ambassadors to demand an apology, the Shah killed one and shaved the beards off the other 2. In the Mongol world, ambassadors were sacred. This was a declaration of total war. Genghis Khan didn't just get angry. He went into the mountains, prayed to the eternal blue sky for 3 days, and then came down with a single goal: the total annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire. When Genghis Khan moved against Khwarezmia in 1219, it wasn't an invasion, it was an extermination event. He brought somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 men. It's hard to grasp the scale of that in the 13th century. Imagine every person in a mid-sized modern city suddenly getting on a horse, grabbing a bow, and riding toward you with zero intention of letting you live. The Shah of Khwarezmia, Muhammad II, had a bigger army, maybe 400,000 men, but he made the classic mistake of fighting the last war. He spread his troops out in garrisons along the cities of the Sir Darya River, thinking the Mongols would just bounce off the walls like barbarians usually did. He assumed they would attack head-on, get tired of sieges, and go home. He assumed wrong. Genghis Khan didn't play by the accepted rules of warfare. He split his army into 4 distinct columns, while his sons Joki and Chagatai attacked the border cities to draw the Shah's attention, and another son, Ogadai, hit the center. Genghis himself did the impossible. He took his Tumans through the Kai-Zilkum Desert, a place thought to be impassable for an army, and popped up literally behind the Shah's main defenses, surrounding the capital of Samarkand before the Shah even knew the war had started. The campaign was frantic, brutal, and ridiculously fast. This was Blitzkrieg 700 years before tanks were invented. Let's talk about Bukhara. It was a jewel of the Islamic world, a center of learning and culture. The Mongols surrounded it. The garrison tried to break out and was cut down to a man. The city elders surrendered, hoping for mercy. Genghis rode his horse right into the great mosque, had cases of wine brought in, and while his troops began looting the city, he ascended the pulpit and delivered one of the hardest lines in military history. He told the trembling citizens, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Then the burning started. The governor of Otrar, the guy who started this whole mess by killing the trade caravan, was captured alive. Legend has it Genghis had molten silver poured into his eyes and ears as payback for his greed. Whether that's true or just a grim campfire story, the reality of what happened to the regular people was worse. The Mongols weaponized terror. If a city resisted, everyone died. Artisans might be spared to be shipped back to Mongolia as slaves, but everyone else, men, women, children, dogs, cats, was put to the sword. They would pile the skulls into great pyramids as markers of their passing. At Nishapur, because a Mongol prince was killed by an arrow from the walls, Genghis's daughter-in-law demanded that every living thing in the city be killed so that no living creature, not even a dog or cat, would be left alive. They even destroyed the irrigation systems, turning fertile farmland back into desert just to spite the future. The Shah of Khwarezmia, the man who thought he could bully the forest people, spent the rest of his short life running in abject terror. He fled west, chased by a Mongol death squad, eventually dying of pneumonia on a tiny leper colony island in the Caspian Sea, dressed in rags. He had lost an empire in 2 years. Chapter 5, The Great Raid and the Dinner Party. While Genghis was busy dismantling Khwarezmia, 2 of his greatest generals, Jib the Arrow and Subutai the Valiant, came to him with an idea. They were chasing the Shah westward anyway. Why not just keep going? They wanted to scout the lands beyond the Caspian Sea, regions that were basically myths to the Mongols. Genghis gave them 20,000 men and told them to return in 3 years. What followed is arguably the greatest cavalry raid in human history. Subutai and Jib took their 20,000 horsemen on a 5,500-mile rampage through nations they had never heard of. They smashed through modern-day Iran, destroyed the Christian kingdom of Georgia, whose knights were considered the finest in the region, crossed the Caucasus Mountains in winter, and emerged onto the steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia. There, they ran into the Cumans, a Turkic nomadic people. The Cumans ran to their neighbors, the princes of the Kievan Rus, the ancestors of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, shouting that a terrible new force was coming. They told the Rus princes, "Today they took our land. Tomorrow they will take yours." The Rus princes, who usually spent their time fighting each other, decided to band together. They assembled a massive coalition army, perhaps 80,000 strong, heavy on armored knights and infantry. They outnumbered Subutai's weary expeditionary force 4-1. They met at the Kalka River in 1223, and here the Europeans got their first taste of the Mongol feigned retreat. The Mongols rode up, fired a few arrows, and then panicked. They turned their horses and ran away in a disorganized mob. The Rus knights, smelling glory and easy loot, broke ranks and chased them. They strung their army out over miles, their heavy horses getting tired, their formations dissolving into a chaotic race. For days the Mongols ran, and then, suddenly, Subutai gave a signal. The Mongol horses, which were fresher and had more stamina, wheeled around in perfect unison. The panicked mob instantly reformed into a disciplined killing machine. They unleashed a storm of arrows into the exhausted, spread-out Rus knights. The heavier European cavalry was surrounded and systematically butchered. The aftermath of the Battle of the Kalka River is legendary for its cruelty. The 3 senior Rus princes surrendered under a promise that no blood would be spilled. The Mongols, always technically true to their word, kept that promise. They took the 3 princes, tied them up, laid them on the ground, and put a giant wooden plank platform on top of them. Then, Subutai and his top generals sat on the platform and had a victory feast, slowly crushing and suffocating the princes beneath them while they drank fermented mare's milk above. It was a message. Your nobility means nothing to us. Your rules of war mean nothing to us. Subutai and Jeeb rode back east to rejoin Genghis, having defeated every army they met, completing a reconnaissance mission that would set the stage for the future horror of Europe. They proved the world was open for the taking. Chapter 6, The Death of a God. In 1227, while campaigning against the rebellious Shizia again, Genghis Khan died. The cause is a mystery. Some say he fell from his horse during a hunt, suffering internal injuries. Others say it was illness or an assassination by a Tangut princess. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is the secrecy. The Mongols couldn't let their enemies know the great unifier was gone. His body was carried back to Mongolia in a funeral procession where anyone unlucky enough to cross its path was instantly killed to keep the secret. He was buried in an unmarked grave near the sacred mountain of Berkhan-Khaldan. According to legend, 1,000 horses were ridden over the area to hide any trace of it, and the soldiers who buried him were then killed by other soldiers, who were then killed themselves, just to be safe. To this day, nobody knows where the most successful conqueror in history is buried. Genghis was gone, but he had left a blueprint. Before he died, he told his sons that a life was too short to conquer the world and charged them with finishing the job. The empire was divided among his 4 legitimate sons by his chief wife, Bort, but there had to be one supreme leader. In 1229, a massive Kurultai elected Genghis's 3rd son, Ogadai, as the new Great Khan. Ogadai was an interesting character. He was known for being generous, charismatic, and a functioning alcoholic. He was the party Khan, but he was also smart enough to listen to his advisors. Under Ogadai, the Mongol Empire started transforming from a nomadic raiding party into a stable state. They built a capital city at Karakoram not because they wanted to live in houses, but because they needed a giant warehouse to store all the loot they were stealing from the rest of the world. They established a taxation system, a postal service, the Yam, and a bureaucracy run by captured Chinese and Persian scribes. But the war didn't stop. Ogadai finished off the Jin dynasty in China in 1234, but the real prize, the one that Subutai had scouted years earlier, lay to the west. Chapter 7. The storm breaks west in 1235. Ogadai called another Kurultai and decided it was time to cash in on Subutai's reconnaissance trip. The target was Urapalavid, to the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. The command was given to Beta, the son of Joki Genghis's eldest son, but the real brains of the operation was the old master himself, Subutai. Now in his late 50s and supposedly so fat he had to ride in a reinforced carriage, Subutai was still the sharpest military mind on the planet. The force they assembled was terrifying, around 130,000 soldiers. They swept into Russia in the winter of 1237. The Russians, used to fighting in the summer, thought the winter would save them. They were wrong. The Mongols used the frozen rivers as highways for their horses. They used gunpowder artillery and siege engines they'd adopted from China to smash Russian cities that had never seen such technology. City after city fell. Ryazan, Moscow, Vladimir. The climax came at Kiev in 1240. Kiev was the mother of Rus cities, a magnificent metropolis with a population of 50,000 and huge stone walls. The Mongol army that surrounded it was so vast that the chroniclers said the creaking of their wagons, the bellowing of their camels, and the neighing of their horses sounded like thunder that drowned out people shouting next to each other. When Kiev fell, the destruction was near total. The famous Golden Gate was smashed. The Church of the Tithes, where the last defenders had gathered, collapsed on top of them, perhaps undermined by Mongol sappers or perhaps just buckling under the weight of the terrified people crowding the roof. A papal envoy visiting Kiev 6 years later found only about 200 houses left standing and described the surrounding plains as being filled with countless human skulls and bones. With Russia broken, the road to Central Europe was open. Panic spread through Christendom. They called the Mongols Tartars, associating them with Tartarus, the Greek hell. They were seen as the literal horsemen of the apocalypse, a divine scourge sent to punish the sins of the West. In 1241, Subutai orchestrated his masterpiece. He was facing the might of Hungary and Poland. If he attacked one, the other might come to its aid, so he split his army. A smaller force under Batu's cousins, Baidar and Kaidan, was sent north to distract Poland, while the main army under Beta and Subutai drove straight into Hungary. The northern pincer worked perfectly. At the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, the Mongol light cavalry met the cream of European knighthood Polish knights, the Teutonic Order, the Knights Templar. It was a slaughter. The heavy European armor was useless against the mobile, faint-retreating Mongol archers. The Polish Duke, Henry the Pious, had his head cut off and paraded around on a spear to demoralize the remaining troops. Meanwhile, Subutai was aiming for Hungary. The Hungarian king Bela IV had assembled a massive army, perhaps 100,000 strong, and met the Mongols at the Sajo River. They cornered the Mongols at the bridge of Mohi. For the first time, the Mongols seemed trapped. They had a major river behind them and a huge army in front. Beta Khan, watching his initial attacks across the bridge fail under heavy crossbow fire, was reportedly ready to retreat. He was furious, yelling at Subutai that he was getting them all killed. But Subutai was playing for chess while everyone else was playing checkers. While Beta kept the Hungarians busy at the bridge, Subutai had taken a large portion of the army downstream, quietly built a pontoon bridge during the night, and crossed the river. When dawn broke on April 11, 1241, the Hungarians woke up to find they weren't facing an army across a river. They were surrounded. The Mongols closed in, firing thousands of arrows, tightening the noose. But Subutai did something brilliant. He left a gap in the encirclement to the west, a clear path to safety. Human nature took over. The Hungarian soldiers, seeing a chance to escape, began to break ranks and run for the gap. As soon as they were strung out and disorganized, the Mongols pounced. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a fox hunt. The Mongols rode down the fleeing Hungarians for days, littering the road to pest with bodies. King Bela barely escaped with his life, fleeing all the way to the Adriatic coast. By the end of 1241, the Mongol army was resting on the plains of Hungary. They had destroyed the major armies of Eastern and Central Europe. There was virtually nothing standing between them and the Atlantic. Vienna was terrified. The Holy Roman Emperor was panicking. The Pope was packing his bags, and then the miracle happened. In early 1242, a messenger arrived at Beta Khan's camp after riding thousands of miles from Mongolia. The great Khan Ogadai was dead. He had drunk himself to death during a hunting trip. By Mongol law, all princes of the blood had to return to Mongolia to attend the Kurultai and elect a new great Khan. Beta, who had his eye on the top job, or at least wanted to make sure his rivals didn't get it, couldn't afford to be stuck in Europe while the power struggle happened back home. Just like that, the storm receded, the massive army wheeled around and rode back east, leaving a shattered, confused, and unbelievably lucky Europe in its wake. If Ogadai hadn't taken that last drink, history as we know it would be fundamentally different. We might all be speaking a derivative of Mongolian today. Chapter 8, The Shadow and the Sword. While the princes in the north were arguing over who got to sit on the big felt rug in Karakoram, the Mongol war machine didn't just stall, it pivoted. The new great Khan, Monkey, wasn't a party animal like his predecessor. He was a cold, calculating administrator who realized that to keep the empire together, he needed to give his brothers something to do. He sent one brother, Kublai, to finish off China, and his other brother, Hulagu, to the west. Hulagu was handed the most terrifying task of all. He was told to suppress the Middle East, and his first target wasn't a king or an emperor. It was a secret society that had been haunting the dreams of every ruler in the region for centuries, the Hashashin, the Assassins. These guys were the original spec ops of the medieval world. They lived in invincible mountain fortresses like Alamut, tucked away in the Alborz Mountains. They didn't have a massive army. They had fanatical devotees who would wait in a marketplace for 6 months just to get close enough to a vizier to slip a dagger between his ribs. They were untouchable. Even the great Saladin had failed to take them out. But Hulagu didn't care about their mystique. He brought something the Middle East hadn't seen on this scale: high-tech Chinese siege engineering. He dragged massive traction trebuchets and thousands of engineers across the mountains. When he got to Alamut in 1256, he didn't try to sneak in. He simply dismantled the mountain. He used heavy artillery to pound the impenetrable walls into dust. The Grand Master of the Assassins, a man named Rukn al-Din, took one look at the Mongol lines, the sheer discipline, and the massive catapults, and realized the era of the Shadow Warrior was over. He surrendered, and true to Mongol form, once they had the keys to the castle, they executed him and wiped the order off the map. But that was just the appetizer. The main course was the center of the world, Baghdad. Chapter 9. The River of Ink. At this point in history, Baghdad wasn't just a city, it was the brain of the planet. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, the home of the House of Wisdom, and a metropolis that had been the beating heart of the Islamic Golden Age for 500 years. If you were a scientist, a poet, or a philosopher, Baghdad was your Mecca. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was ... Well, he wasn't Genghis Khan. He was a man who spent more time with his exotic birds and his treasury than he did with his generals. When Ulug's messengers arrived demanding that the Caliph tear down his walls and submit, Al-Mustasim sent back a letter that was basically a 13th century "Do you know who I am?" He told Hulagu that the entire Muslim world would rise up and crush the Mongols if they touched Baghdad. It was a bluff, and Hulagu called it. In early 1258, the Mongol army surrounded the city. They did something the locals thought was impossible. They used palm trees to build a wall around the city's wall, trapping everyone inside. They flooded the Caliph's army by breaking the irrigation canals, drowning thousands of defenders before the siege even really started. When the walls finally breached after 2 weeks of pounding, the horror that followed is something historians still struggle to describe. This wasn't just a sack, it was a cultural lobotomy. The Mongols spent a week systematically killing hundreds of thousands of people. The accounts say the Tigris River ran red with the blood of the citizens, and then it ran black. Why black? Because the Mongols took the contents of the House of Wisdom, centuries of irreplaceable medical, scientific, and philosophical manuscripts, and threw them into the river to use as a bridge for their horses. The ink from the books stained the water for miles. As for the Caliph, Hulagu had a specific problem with him. Mongol tradition forbade spilling royal blood on the ground because they believed it would cause the earth to curse them. So, to kill the leader of the Muslim world without spilling his blood, they wrapped almost Asim in a thick felt rug and had a cavalry unit trample him to death. They literally rolled the caliph into a carpet and ran him over with horses. The Islamic Golden Age didn't just end, it was stomped into the dirt. Chapter 10: The Spring of Goliath. With Baghdad in ruins, the Mongols looked toward Egypt, the last major Islamic power. The Mamluks, a caste of elite warrior slaves who had taken over Egypt, watched the smoke rising from the east and knew they were next. Hulagu sent his usual surrender or die letter to the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz. The letter was classic Mongol trash talk. "You have heard how we have conquered a vast empire. We have killed the people and seized their children. Resistance is in vain." But the Mamluks were different. They were trained from childhood in the same horse archery and steppe tactics as the Mongols. They didn't panic. They killed the Mongol ambassadors and hung their heads on the gates of Cairo. Just as Hulagu was preparing to march into Egypt, history repeated itself. News came from Mongolia. The Great Khan monkey was dead, killed by disease during a siege in China. Just like after Ogade's death, Hulagu had to pull the bulk of his army back to deal with the succession crisis. He left behind a skeleton crew of about 10,000 to 15,000 men under his best general, Kit Buka. The Mamluks saw their opening. In 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, the two forces met. The Mamluks used the Mongols' own trick against them. Their general, Baybars, led a feigned retreat, drawing the Mongols into an ambush in the narrow valley. When the Mongols realized they'd been played, they fought with their usual ferocity, but for the first time, they were facing an army that wouldn't break. Sultan Qutuz supposedly threw off his helmet so his men could see his face and charged into the thick of it, screaming, "O Islam!" The Mongols were defeated. Kit Buka was captured and executed. It wasn't the biggest battle in history, but it was the most important one the Mongols ever lost. It broke the spell of invincibility. For the first time, a Mongol advance had been stopped and the territory actually held by the defenders. The storm had finally hit a wall it couldn't break. Chapter 11: The Great Divorce. While the Mamluks were celebrating, the Mongol Empire was having a nervous breakdown. The death of Monkey triggered a civil war that would permanently fracture the greatest land empire the world had ever seen. The fight was between two of Genghis's grandsons, Kublai and Arik Bey. This wasn't just a fight for a title, it was a fight for the soul of the Mongols. Arik Bey represented the old guard. He wanted the Mongols to stay on the steppe, live in tents, and keep raiding. Kublai, who had been living in China for years, saw the future in cities and administration. He wanted to be an emperor, not just a Khan. The Toluid civil war lasted for years. It was brother against brother, Mongol against Mongol. Kublai eventually won, mostly because he controlled the grain supplies of China and could starve out the traditionalists in the north. But the price of victory was the empire itself. The Western Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia basically stopped taking orders from the center. The Universal Empire was now for separate kingdoms that occasionally tried to kill each other. Kublai Khan moved the capital from the steppe to a new city called Khan Balik, which we now know as Beijing. He founded the Yuan dynasty. He was the first non-Chinese person to rule the whole country, and he did it by becoming more Chinese than the Chinese. He wore silk, he patronized the arts, and he built a naval fleet that made the world tremble. But he still had that Mongol itch for conquest. And he had his eyes on a group of islands that refused to pay tribute: Japan. Chapter 12, The Wines of the Gods. In 1274, Kublai sent a massive fleet to Japan. The Japanese samurai, used to one-on-one honorable combat where you'd shout your lineage before fighting, were absolutely horrified by the Mongols. The Mongols didn't care about your family tree. They fought in disciplined phalanxes, used exploding thunder crash bombs, and rained thousands of arrows from a distance. The samurai were getting hammered, but then, as the Mongol fleet sat in the harbor, a storm blew in. It wrecked the ships and forced the survivors to retreat. Kublai was furious. He spent 7 years building an even bigger fleet. In 1281, he sent what was, at the time, the largest amphibious invasion force in history, 140,000 men on thousands of ships. It was D-Day 700 years early. The Japanese had spent those 7 years building a massive stone wall along the coast of Hakata Bay. For weeks, the Mongols couldn't find a place to land their horses. They were stuck on their ships in the summer heat, with disease spreading and the Japanese launching daring night raids in small boats, setting the Mongol ships on fire. And then it happened again. A massive typhoon, even bigger than the first, slammed into the Japanese coast. It ground the Mongol fleet into splinters against the rocks. Thousands of soldiers drowned, and those who made it to shore were hunted down by the samurai. The Japanese called this storm the kamikaze, the divine wind. They believed their gods had personally stepped in to save them from the Mongol monster. For Kublai Khan, it was a humiliating, expensive disaster. It was the moment the Mongol expansion in the east finally reached its limit. The invincible horsemen of the steppe had been defeated by a spring in Galilee and a breeze in the Pacific. The high water mark of the empire had been reached. Chapter 13, The Golden Cage. By the late 1200s, the Mongol Empire had reached its physical limit, but it had entered a phase historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. It's one of the great ironies of history. The people who caused more death than almost anyone else also created the safest era for global travel the world had ever seen. Because the entire Silk Road, from the shores of the Black Sea to the ports of South China, was under one albeit fractured administration, trade exploded. A person could travel with a golden tablet of 13th century VIP pass and go from Italy to Beijing without being robbed, because everyone knew that if you touched a traveler under the Khan's protection, your entire village would be turned into a smoking crater. This is the world Marco Polo stepped into. He wasn't discovering a primitive land. He was visiting a civilization that was, in many ways, more advanced than Europe. He saw paper money, which Europeans thought was a magic trick. He saw black stones coal being burned for heat, and he saw a postal system so efficient it would make modern delivery services blush. But there was a rot starting to set in at the heart of the Mongol courts. The fierce, milk-drinking nomads of Genghis's era were becoming civilized, and in the Mongol mind, that was a death sentence. In China, the Mongol elites were being absorbed by Chinese culture. In Persia, they converted to Islam. In Russia, they became a ruling class of tax collectors. The warriors were trading their bows for ledgers and their tents for palaces. They were losing the hardness that had made them conquerors. And as they settled down, they started to fight each other more than their enemies. The four Khanates, the Yuan in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in the Middle East, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia spent the late 1300s in a perpetual state of civil war. But the Mongols didn't fall to a great army. They fell to a microscopic one. Chapter 14, The Unseen Invader. In the 1330s, something started moving along those very same trade routes the Mongols had worked so hard to protect. It started in the steppe, or perhaps in the foothills of the Himalayas. It traveled in the saddlebags of merchants and the fur of rats, the Black Death. The plague was the ultimate Mongol invasion, but one they couldn't control. It hit the Mongol heartlands first. Because the Mongols were so mobile and so connected, the disease spread like wildfire through their camps and cities. It decimated their population, killed their leaders, and shattered the economic ties that held the empire together. In 1346, during a siege of the city of Kaffa in the Crimea, the Mongols of the Golden Horde were dying of the plague. In a final, gruesome act of biological warfare, they reportedly used trebuchets to catapult their own plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. When the Italian merchants inside the city fled back to Europe, they brought the Black Death with them. The plague broke the back of the Mongol Empire. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into chaos in 1335. The Yuan dynasty in China, already struggling with massive floods and famine, was overthrown by a peasant rebellion in 1368. The last Mongol emperor fled back to the steppe, leaving behind the Forbidden City and the Silk Robes. In Russia, the Mongol yoke lasted longer, but even there, the power was fading. In 1480, at the Great Stand on the Ugra River, the Russian princes finally refused to pay tribute, and the Mongols, seeing they were outnumbered and out-resourced, simply turned around and walked away. The storm had run out of wind. Chapter 15, The Ghost of the Steppe. So, what was it all for? Millions dead, cities erased, libraries burned. Was Genghis Khan just a monster, or was he something more? The legacy of the Mongol invasions is written in our very blood. Studies suggest that roughly 1 in 200 men alive today are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. His biological impact is almost as large as his political one. But look deeper. The Mongols connected the East and the West for the first time. They spread technology like gunpowder, the compass, and printing from China to Europe, technologies that would eventually allow Europe to launch the Age of Discovery. Without the Mongols, there might have been no Marco Polo, and without Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus might never have sailed west. They taught the world about religious tolerance, not because they were enlightened, but because they didn't care what god you prayed to as long as you paid your taxes. Their courts were a mix of Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Jews all arguing at the same table. The Mongol Empire was a bridge made of bones. It was a terrifying, bloody, and necessary explosion that ended the isolation of the ancient world and forced the Middle Ages to turn into the modern era. Today, the steppe is quiet. The great stone cities they built have mostly returned to the dust. But every time you use a passport, every time you send a letter through a global mail system, and every time you think about how small our world has become, you are seeing a shadow of the empire that Genghis built. The wind still whispers across the plains of Mongolia, and if you listen closely, you can still hear the rhythmic thumping of 100,000 horses. The storm is gone, but the world it left behind is the one we're still living in. Chapter 16, The Iron Limp Tamerlane's Shadow. Just when the world thought the Mongol storm had finally blown itself out, a ghost appeared in the ruins. By the mid-1300s, the empire was a fractured puzzle of squabbling khanates, but in the valley of the Sir Daria, a man arose who wanted to piece it back together with blood and bone. He wasn't a direct descendant of Genghis Khan, a fact that haunted him, but he claimed to be the Great Khan's spiritual heir. His name was Timur, known to history as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame. If Genghis was a cold, efficient machine, Timur was a dramatic, intellectual poet warrior who also happened to be one of the most terrifying mass murderers to ever walk the earth. He didn't just want to conquer, he wanted to perform conquest. He spent 35 years campaigning across every compass point. He smashed the Golden Horde in Russia, basically ending their dominance forever. He invaded India, slaughtering so many people in Delhi that it took the city a century to recover. He humbled the rising Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Ankara, capturing the Sultan and, according to legend, keeping him in a literal iron cage. But Timur's conquests were different. He didn't build a lasting administration like Kublai or Ogadai. He was a whirlwind. He would destroy a city, build a pyramid of 70,000 human skulls outside its gates, and then move on to the next target. He turned the concept of the Mongol invasion into a personal theater of terror. When he died in 1405 while on his way to try and reconquer China, his empire immediately fell apart. He was the last of the great nomad conquerors, the final violent flare of the steppes' power before the age of gunpowder and oceans truly took over. Chapter 17. The Mughal echo. Even as the Mongol identity faded, it didn't disappear, it just moved. One of Timur's great-great-grandsons, a man named Babur, found himself kicked out of his ancestral home in Central Asia by rival tribes. With nothing but a small band of followers and a few cannons, he looked south toward the Indian subcontinent. Babur considered himself a Mongol or Mughal in the local tongue. In 1526, he won the Battle of Panipat using a combination of Mongol cavalry tactics and Ottoman gunpowder. This founded the Mughal Empire, the dynasty that gave the world the Taj Mahal, the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and a period of incredible cultural fusion. When you look at the intricate architecture of northern India or the administrative systems that the British later borrowed to run their own empire, you are looking at the refined, settled descendants of the horse lords. The Mongols didn't just die out, they became the architects of some of the most beautiful civilizations in human history. Chapter 18. The Silk Road's last breath. By the 1500s, the world had fundamentally shifted. The Mongol peace had been so successful at moving ideas that it eventually rendered the Mongols themselves obsolete. European mariners, tired of paying taxes to the various middlemen of the Silk Road and the crumbling khanates, started looking for ways to get to the riches of the East by sea. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India, the Silk Road died. The vast inland heart of Eurasia, which had been the center of the world for 2,000 years, suddenly became a flyover zone. The nomadic way of life was no match for the musket and the galleon. The Mongols had forced the world to connect, and in doing so, they created a global economy that no longer needed the horse. Chapter 19. The genetic blueprint. We often talk about history as something that happened to other people in other times, but the Mongol invasions are still happening inside your cells. In 2003, a massive genetic study sent shockwaves through the scientific community. It found that a specific Y chromosomal lineage traceable back to the region and time of Genghis Khan is present in about 8% of the men in a large region of Asia. That's roughly 16 million men, or 0.5% of the total male population on Earth. Genghis and his sons didn't just conquer territories, they conquered populations. In the brutal logic of the 13th century, the prize for the conqueror was total access. This genetic legacy is a silent, biological record of the terror and the scale of the Mongol era. It means that for millions of people, the story of the Mongol invasions isn't just a history lesson, it's a family tree. Chapter 20. The final reckoning. As we look back at the dust clouds on the horizon, we have to ask, was it worth it? If you were a citizen of Baghdad in 1258, or a Rus prince under a wooden platform, the answer is a resounding no. The Mongol invasions were a human catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. They may have killed up to 40 million people, a staggering percentage of the global population at the time. Entire civilizations were deleted from the map. But history isn't a moral fable, it's a series of consequences. The Mongols were the great levelers. They smashed the old, stagnant empires of the Middle Ages and created a blank slate. They facilitated the movement of paper, which led to the printing press. They moved gunpowder, which ended the era of the armored knight and the feudal lord. They moved the compass, which led to the mapping of the globe. They were a brutal, bloody bridge that the world crossed to get from the ancient world to the modern one. They taught us that no wall is high enough, no desert is wide enough, and no empire is permanent. Today, the Great Khan sits in a giant, stainless steel statue in the Mongolian wilderness, looking out over the empty steppe. He is a national hero in his homeland and a demon in the history books of others. But he is, undeniably, the man who made the modern world possible. The storm has passed, the dust has settled, and the hoof prints have been washed away by the rain. But the world we live in, this interconnected, globalized, technological world, is the house that Genghis built. Chapter 21, The Paper Revolution. To truly grasp why the Mongol invasions weren't just a series of fires and funerals, we have to look at the things they carried that weren't swords. The Mongols were the world's first truly global postal workers. Before the Khans, if you sent a letter from China to Europe, there was a 99% chance it would end up in the hands of a bandit or rot in a cellar. But under the Yam system, the Mongol Pony Express information started moving at a speed that felt like sorcery. Because the Mongols had no use for local bureaucracy, they simplified everything. They standardized weights, measures, and most importantly, they fell in love with paper. In the West, people were still writing on expensive animal skins, parchment, and vellum. It took a whole herd of sheep to make one Bible, but in China, they'd been making cheap, durable paper for centuries. The Mongols moved that technology westward. They also brought the idea of paper money. When Marco Polo first saw a Mongol official paying for goods with a piece of printed bark, he thought it was a hallucination. He couldn't understand how a piece of paper could be worth a bar of gold. But the Mongols understood the power of the state. They realized that if the Khan said it was money, it was money. This wasn't just a convenience, it was the birth of modern finance. The Mongol invasions forced the world to move away from heavy metals and toward the abstract world of credit and currency. Chapter 22, The Master of Maps. The Mongols were also obsessed with geography. If you're going to conquer the world, you need to know where the mountains are and where the rivers end. Before Genghis, maps were mostly mappamundi, theological drawings where Jerusalem was the center of the world and monsters lived at the edges. The Mongols changed that. They gathered Persian astronomers, Chinese cartographers, and European travelers in the same room. They funded the first truly scientific maps of the Eurasian landmass. They measured the stars to navigate the deserts. They turned the world from a collection of isolated islands of civilization into a single, cohesive map. This Mongol mapping had a direct ripple effect. When the Mongol Empire finally fractured and the Silk Road became dangerous again, the Europeans didn't forget that China was over there. They didn't forget that the world was round and vast. The maps created during the Mongol era became the blueprints for the European age of exploration. When you look at the early maps used by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, you are looking at the intellectual descendants of Mongol intelligence gathering. Chapter 23, The Siege That Never Ended. We often think of the Mongol invasions as a thing of the 1200s, but the tactics they perfected never really went away. They were the pioneers of psychological warfare. They understood that the battle is won in the mind before it's won on the field. Think about the modern shock and awe campaigns. That's pure Mongol strategy. The way they would use smoke screens, the way they would manipulate local rumors to make their numbers seem 10 times larger, the way they would offer a city the choice: surrender and live, or resist and be erased. This wasn't barbarism, it was a highly calculated, mathematical approach to violence designed to minimize Mongol casualties. They were also the fathers of modern artillery coordination. At the Siege of Xiangyang, which lasted 5 years, the Mongols used massive trebuchets designed by Persian engineers to break a Chinese city. They were the first to treat a siege not as a waiting game, but as a scientific problem to be solved with heavy machinery and engineering. Every modern army that uses long-range strikes to soften a target before an advance is, in a way, using a Mongol playbook. Chapter 24, The Great Leveling. One of the most profound, yet hidden, legacies of the invasions was the great leveling of social classes. In the pre-Mongol world, your life was determined by who your father was. Feudalism was a cage. But the Mongols didn't care about your bloodline unless you were a descendant of Genghis, of course. They promoted based on merit. They didn't care if you were a shoemaker or a prince. If you could lead 1,000 men or fix a bridge, you were given a title. This meritocratic virus spread into the cultures they conquered. It broke the power of the old landed nobilities. In many ways, the Mongol invasions were the first modern revolution, a violent tearing down of the old world order to make room for something more efficient, more brutal, and more connected. Chapter 25, The Final Echo in the Wind. If you travel to the heart of Mongolia today, to the capital of Ulaanbaatar, you'll see Genghis Khan everywhere. He's on the money, he's on the beer bottles, he's on the massive statues that dominate the skyline. For the people of Mongolia, he isn't a conqueror, he's the father of the nation. He took a group of warring tribes who were killing each other over muddy water and turned them into the masters of the world. But his true monument isn't in Mongolia, it's the world itself. It's the fact that you can buy a product made in China, sold by a company in America, and have it delivered to your door in London. It's the fact that our cultures are so deeply entwined that we can't imagine them apart. The Mongol invasions were the big bang of globalization. It was a violent, terrifying birth, but it was the birth of us. So, next time you look at a map or pay for something with a piece of paper or hear about a new technology traveling across the globe in seconds, remember the horsemen. Remember the dust. Remember the man who sat in a tent and decided that the horizon wasn't a boundary, but an invitation. The storm is over. The hoof beats have faded. But the world is still shaking from the thunder they left behind.